Hello my friends and welcome back to the channel. On the 25th of June 2026, Ukraine began a 40-day drone operation against Russia. And this operation was designed to accomplish a couple of things. Number one was to get the Russian population to question Vladimir Putin and the wider Russian leadership. And number two was to destabilize the Russian economy and disrupt the logistics here and there. Now, the 40 days are over and now the Atlantic is reporting on the results. Just a spoiler alert, they're not looking fantastic. But guess who's to blame? As per the Atlantic. Well, come on, he's not a tough guess. It's Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is to blame for the fact that the Ukraine's 40-day drone operation hasn't exactly met the intended results. What a shock. With that, my friends, let's just get into the story because it's a long story and there's plenty of things to talk about. Mass anti-war protests in Russia unlikely anytime soon. Ukraine and its allies may have hoped that frustrated Russians would revolt. After more than 4 years, the war Russia launched against Ukraine has finally come home. One might assume that people in the aggressor country would demand an end to the war and begin pressuring Vladimir Putin. However, the Atlantic writes that mass uprisings are unlikely either now or in the near future. Let's stop right here because there's so much to unpack even from that one single paragraph. Because this paragraph shows the misconception in the West and in Ukraine. To me, my friends, it is absolutely baffling that they actually believed that the 40-day operation would lead to mass Russian uprisings. I've talked about this all summer, and I said it from the very first day, from the 25th of June, that this is highly unlikely to happen. And now the Atlantic is actually concluding the same thing. What a shock, right? And I'll explain why that is. You see, take a look at this picture. This is the picture that they've chosen for this headline. I didn't choose it, they did. Now what do we see here? Well, we see some Russian fishermen fishing while there's a big column of smoke behind them, which I think results from a wild berries explosion or something. Now what does this picture tell you? Now I'm not going to speak for anybody else, I'm just going to speak for myself. And I'll tell you what I see when I look at such a picture. It's all about the way people everywhere perceive a war. You see, when we watch the television and we see a war going on, or we read a newspaper and the war is in the newspaper or on the media, we immediately understand at a rational level that that's a war. We don't need anybody to explain that or to reinforce the idea. We can clearly see it. But, and this is the paradox, it doesn't necessarily mean that in our minds we feel the war. We understand it, again, at a rational level. And this is precisely why the Russian fishermen are fishing there while there's big columns of smoke and bombings in the background. Because what do people associate with war? Well, it's military targets, it's ground forces, front lines close to them. That's when people feel the war. Now, the Ukraine's 40-day drone operation has met none of those conditions. They haven't really struck that many military targets. They've targeted wild berries and refineries and whatnot. Also, the Ukrainian forces are not fighting deep inside Russian territory, and there's no ground forces to begin with. This is why the people in Russia, not all, obviously, but a large portion of people in Russia, don't necessarily perceive that as a war. They perceive it as acts of something else. And the reason I'm making this point is because the Atlantic says that the war Russia launched against Ukraine has finally come home. Again, that's debatable, that if the war has actually come home or not. This is the part that the West really struggles to understand. It's all about the way people perceive things. And I've said it from the beginning, all of those drone strikes on wild berries and refineries, etc., that's gonna piss the Russian population off even more. Now, does this mean that the Ukrainian operation was a complete failure? Well, not necessarily, depending on how you look at things. One thing is for certain, Ukraine has managed to cause damage to the Russian economy and to disrupt the logistics in certain places, and people have also lost their lives. This was serious. But that being said, the biggest question of all is, do the pros outweigh the cons? Because now we get to the cons. You see, I think it was Alex from History Legends. He has made a video, I think about a couple of days ago, where he explained all of this very, very nicely. And there was one particular part of his video that really stuck with me. He showed that in the first few days when Ukraine launched this operation, the success rate, the hit rate was very, very high, something like 70 to 80%. So that meant that the Russian air defenses were not exactly fine-tuned at the moment. But then, from the first day onwards, with each and every single passing day, the Ukrainian drones were finding it very, very difficult to even get past the Russian air defenses. There were days when the hit rate was something like 2 or 3%, so negligible. What does that mean? Well, it means that the Russians have managed to fine-tune their air defenses. So even though it had significant consequences on Russia, this Ukrainian operation, it was also a blessing in disguise for the Russian air defenses, because now they're more prepared than they've been before. Also, another Another con to this is the fact that the Russian ballistic missiles strikes on Ukraine have increased right around the time when Ukraine launched this drone operation. Now, people would argue, and I've seen plenty of them. I think Andriy Sibia was one who argued that, oh, folks, Russia was going to do that anyway. Maybe, we'll never know. But what we do know is that the Russians have increased their ballistic missile strikes on Ukraine right around the time when Ukraine launched this 40-day drone operation. And especially, we have to keep in mind that the Russian missile strikes are taking place at the time when Ukraine is struggling for Patriot air defenses. Nonetheless, let's go to the second paragraph. Russians remain afraid of the authorities' denunciations to the FSB and the rest for such offenses as laying flowers or reading a poem near the monument of a Ukrainian poet. In most families, complaints about the Kremlin regime remain confined to the kitchen, the Atlantic writes. In other words, the reason the Russians are not revolting against Vladimir Putin is because they're afraid to express themselves. That's what this paragraph is basically saying. They keep the sensitive conversations for the kitchen, Jimmy. In the kitchen, we gather around where nobody's listening and we whisper to one another. This goes back to a Western interpretation of Russia, and I'm saying this on a serious note. A lot of people in the West, and I mean a lot of people in the West, they do believe that today's Russia is the exact same thing as 1962 Soviet Union. For a lot of people in the West, there's simply no difference. They actually believe that. I'm not sure if the people who write for The Atlantic believe that, but I can tell you that there's a lot of ordinary people in the West who believe it. I can tell you that for a fact. The article also notes that Moscow hardly resembles the capital of a country waging a war of attrition. The city center is filled with decorations and flower beds. Despite the lack of signs of mass protests, Putin is preparing. The Atlantic notes, this year the Kremlin increased funding for Russia's National Guard and other law enforcement agencies to a record level of more than $47 billion. When I read this particular portion for the first time, I immediately smiled. Do you know why that is? They're saying that the fact that Putin has increased the budget for law enforcement agencies and the National Guard to $47 billion, well, that's a testament to the fact that he's preparing. Really? Well, what was Russia's budget for the same National Guard and law enforcement agencies in yesteryears? Well, in 2023, believe it or not, it was actually $52 billion. It was $52 billion. And in every single year before or around 2023, it was at around 41, 42, 39. So increasing it to 47, what does that even mean? Well, clearly, to The Atlantic, that's proof that Putin is preparing. You know, all I'm about to say is that probably Russia is not a big fan of not funding the police. Let's go to the next one. On August 8, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky summed up the results of a 40-day operation aimed at exerting pressure on Russia, saying he was satisfied with the results. He estimated that Ukrainian strikes had cost trillions of rubles in damage to Russian logistics. They did, and that's not debatable. That's a fact. It has caused damage to the Russian economy. I mean, that's probably the only part that there's nothing to debate about. However, that was never the only goal or even the primary goal of this operation, because Zelensky and everybody else in the Ukrainian leadership must have understood from the very beginning that no amount of striking wildberries and Russian refineries will affect the Russian economy to a significant enough degree in order to matter on the battlefield in Ukraine. Because yes, Russia's economy was weakened by these strikes, but it wasn't weakened enough to make a difference for Ukraine on the battlefield. So again, this is what I'm saying. This cannot possibly have been the only goal, but this is the only one that was achieved. So this is the one that's being pushed forward. With that said, my friends, let me know what you think about this story in the comment section. I mean, the comment section is wide open. And with that, let's just go to the next one. EU is preparing largest sanctions package against Russia. Kallas said the EU sanctions have already inflicted significant damage on Russia, depriving the country of more than 1 trillion euros. I'm not exactly sure how they came up with that number, but let's just go with it. You know, let's just run with it. Let's just assume it's true. Do you know how much people in Europe actually care about that? The ordinary people of Europe. Well, probably not very much. And do you know how I know that? I've never really heard a conversation between two men over a beer saying, oh man, I'm doing so much better. And then the other one asks, why? And this one says, well, actually, you know, we've deprived the Russian economy of 1 trillion euros. I'm doing so much better economically. I've never heard those conversations. Have you? Let me know if you have heard them. The people in Europe actually care about how much of that 1 trillion has actually boomeranged against Europe? Because, I know it may come as a shock, but the European people care about the European economy, and the American people care about the American economy, and the Russian people care about the Russian economy, and the Ukrainian people care about the Ukrainian economy. It ain't rocket science. So those numbers might look good on a teleprompter, but in practice, it doesn't change much in Europe. Trump directs Hegseth to scale back joint military exercises with South Korea. Quote, these exercises are not only costly, with much of these costs paid for by the United States of America, as usual, but send a signal that is totally inappropriate and hostile, Trump wrote on Truth Social, while emphasizing his very good relationship with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Interesting, isn't it? This newfound brotherhood between Trump and Kim Jong-un, well, it results in Donald Trump not really wanting to exercise with North Korea as much. I mean, they're still gonna exercise, but there's gonna be scaled back. Interesting friendship, isn't it? The flowers are the only thing missing. Now, on a serious note, there's 2 actual potential reasons for why we actually see this, in the real world that is. Recently, South Korea has declined Donald Trump's offer to basically assist the United States with Iran, and also South Korea, very recently, I think it was last week when I discussed that, South Korea has declined to offer arms to Ukraine. I've covered the article. They basically said that we're going to be there for Ukraine, we're going to help with reconstruction, education, everything but weapons. That was basically the gist of it. So South Korea, it's 0 for 2. It declined Iran, it declined Ukraine, so eventually Donald Trump is going to scale back the exercises. But of course, Kim Jong-un might be happy. With that, let's go to the next one. Germany rethinks law protecting politicians from insults. Criminal investigations of people who have referred to Merz as, quote, Pinocchio and, quote, lying Fritz have prompted calls for reform across the political divide. We take seriously the criticism that, in practice, it may have created the impression of a special legal privilege for politicians, said Suzanne Hill, a lawmaker for Merz CDU. Such preferential treatment was never the intention of the legislature. There's not much to comment on this article, but I just thought it was very funny, which is why I'm featuring it. And the only thing I'll say is that this right here, this backpedaling, is not the first time we see it. There's been multiple cases over the last many years that I can remember when certain bills and laws were passed only to be met with a lot of backlash. And then people say, well, hold on a minute, these things that you don't like, these were never the intended effect. Well, then what was? Nonetheless, my friends, I'm just gonna leave this video right here. Let me know what you think in the comments below. It's been a pleasure as always, and I will see you in the next one. Take care and bye-bye.